Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. I already put out a video today with some of the teasers that Grinding Games had put out, but then they went and surprised me by putting out a second lot. I was kind of hoping that they would be dumping a whole bunch of Transfigured gems on us. They didn't do that, but instead they gave us 2 Transfigured gems, an FAQ, and also a number of additional patch note changes over and above the ones that were outlined in the earlier video today. I'll put a link to today's earlier video down in the description of this video, and it doesn't matter which order you watch the two in. So firstly, we got 2 Transfigured versions of Icicle Mine. Icicle Mine fires projectiles in a circle. Icicle Mine of Fanning is more of an arc like Ethereal Knives. And note that it has better damage numbers. And Icicle Mine of Sabotage totally transforms the skill. Icicle Mine of Sabotage massively jumps up the reservation cost. Instead of reserving 6 mana per mine, it starts reserving 15, which is ouch. And then on top of that, each mine applies 40% increased critical strike chance to hits against enemies near it, up to a maximum of 500%. Now this maximum of 500% is a hard cap. It doesn't matter how many Icicle Mines you've got down, it doesn't matter how much aura effect you've got, that 500% is a limit. So, Icicle Mine of Sabotage is essentially transforming the skill entirely. Instead of putting down something that exudes a weak aura until you do a detonation chain and then do damage with it, with the primary focus of the skill being the damage, here the primary focus is the aura. You drop down a couple of Icicle Mines and this gives you a massive crit boost against enemies that are close to those Icicle Mines. In most circumstances then you don't even detonate them, you just replace them when they time out. They're there for the debuff, they're not there to deal damage. Will this be widely used? Absolutely no. Will it have a niche use case? Yes. It has a powerful utility effect that's worth keeping in mind, especially if you're playing with a build that is absolutely reliant upon landing critical strikes on enemies. Icicle Mine of Sabotage may, in that case, be something worth your while keeping your eye on. Now next there were some additional changes to the patch notes. Some of these were covered in the earlier video today, but there's been a couple of new ones after that. Firstly, an updated note for Earthshatter. It's now going to increase the number of maximum spikes that you get based upon the quality of the gem. This is a buff over what was earlier announced. Secondly, Ice Crash. Now this is a skill that not many people use, but it's getting a pretty big buff here. 20% quality causes the skill to gain 15% of physical damage as extra cold damage. Now those of you that have played Ice Crash before will know that the Eternal Labyrinth enchant was granting the same benefit as 20% quality will grant in the future. However, there's something important to note here, and that is that 20 quality is not the limit. There are plenty of ways to raise your quality higher than this. Enhance doesn't get there on Ice Crash, it's just not providing enough damage even if you've got Enhance 5, and most of the time you'll have a lower level of Enhance than 5. However, Ashes of the Stars is definitely pretty good value on the new Ice Crash. It's going to take your damage from 115% of physical damage applied as cold up to 137%. This is a 19% more multiplier in damage, and that makes Ashes a reasonably strong choice for your amulet slot. There's also a few more esoteric ways to get yourself increased quality on gems, and those are going to be worth investigating with this. The key thing though, does this compensate for the loss of Heatshiver? I think the answer here is unfortunately going to be a no. Ice Crash is likely to be worse in 3.23 than it was in 3.22, and this is going to be the case for basically all cold damage skills. Power Siphon has received some updates over what was originally mentioned, and it is getting a lot more critical strike chance per power charge, and it is getting a lot more critical strike multiplier per power charge. Basically, Power Siphon's quality bonus has been buffed a lot. Vaal Power Siphon is receiving some different changes here. In many cases this is a buff, but this is not a strict buff. Vaal Power Siphon performs better than it used to if you have maximum power charges on most builds, and probably a bit worse if you have no power charges. Purifying Flame has received some buffs to its AoE. And the only other thing is some Ruthless only changes to Sentinel of Radiance. Now, there's an FAQ that's come out that clarifies exactly what the awkward line around Ralakesh's Impatience means, among other things. So let's go through all of those questions. Firstly, where are the gems? Something came up today that prevented us from both getting the first batch of Transfigured gems and the regular 2020 gems out today. We apologise for the delay and are keen to release them as soon as possible. To hold you over, here is Icicle Mines, as we discussed before. What I assume has happened here is just straightforward milestone slippage. It happens in every big project. Someone encounters an unexpected difficulty, maybe one of the base qualities kept causing bugs, and they needed to decide whether they were going to completely rework it, or whether they were going to remove it. That decision hasn't been made because the decision maker's not in, and as a result we don't have the Transfigured gems. Hopefully we'll get them sometime during business hours tomorrow, New Zealand time. The next question relates to the Affliction League content specifically, and it is asking for clarification on how you earn Wildwood Ascendancy points. A quick recap for those of you that might have missed the trailer. These are the stacking second Ascendancy that you can get that is tied to the Affliction content. Your first 2 Wildwood Ascendancy points are required when you first meet the relevant NPC and choose their specialization. Now in the FAQ on livestream day, they did say that this is probably going to be about Act 5. Now I'm assuming that's Act 5 if you focus a bit on interacting with this content. Of course, I could be wrong there. The next 4 points come from 2 quests that are run for each NPC. The final 2 points come from defeating the King of the Misc, and like was mentioned in that livestream trailer, that is probably going to be comparable in difficulty to beating Lycia in the Sanctum. This will then unlock the final 2 points for all 3 Wildwood Ascendancies. Now the big news here is that defeating the King of the Misc when you spec into one of the Ascendancies will unlock those points for the other 2 as well. So that means that you only need to do this once. And if you manage to sequence break this by doing it out of order through multiplayer or something else, then it will still count towards the points even if you're not yet on that stage of the quest. The next question asks what's up with the new wording on Ralakesh's Impatience, because this has been the single most asked question by veteran players that I've seen. The Ralakesh's Impatience unique boot no longer has lose all frenzy, endurance and power charges when you move, or causes your minimum endurance, frenzy or power charges to be equal to your maximum when stationary. It now has count as having maximum number of endurance charges, frenzy charges and power charges, and this change affects existing items. What this means is that the number of charges that you've got at any given moment will still be tracked. However, whatever your maximum number of charges is, for almost all purposes, the game will treat you as having that maximum number of charges. For example, if your minimum endurance charges is 0, your maximum is 9, and your current endurance charges are 2, you'll be treated as having 9 endurance charges for the purposes of working out how much damage you take, how much your elemental resistances are, and the like. But if a monster has the capacity to steal charges from you, it can only steal 2. And probably most importantly, if you've got the capacity to spend charges, it looks like you can only spend the 2 you actually have. What does this mean from a build's perspective? If you felt like your planned use for Ralakesh's Impatience only worked because of a technicality of the wording of the old boots, then it's been broken. If, on the other hand, you're using these just for generic offense on a build, then they still work. In particular, this is really good news for trappers and for miners, who will have maximum frenzy charges and maximum power charges basically all of the time. One last thing that's not entirely clear is what the interaction is with unique belts like Arn's Anguish. These are the ones that drop from the Maven, and they have some total transformation of the way that charges work on your character. My interpretation is that these will still allow you to have frenzy, endurance and power charges at your maximum for Ralakesh's Impatience, but that you will also be able to get the Arn's Anguish exclusive charges if you're able to generate normal charges. However, I'm only 90% sure of that answer, so I wouldn't mind seeing that clarified in a future FAQ. Other things that the new NPCs sell to you tradable. Yes, charms, tinctures, and special corpses. What's up with the Ravenous buff? Now this is tied to one of the Affliction League Ascendancies. Is the Ravenous buff lost when I change zones? Does it persist after I die? And the answer to both of those questions is you lose it in both cases. You mentioned the Maven being Eldritch. Are all bosses Eldritch in nature, or are there others? And the answer is not all bosses are Eldritch. What happens to Micro-Distillery belts when there is a tincture placed in the 5th flask slot? The answer is that tinctures are not flasks. They work. They work just fine. Now, one very important thing that needs to be said about tinctures here. There are some tinctures that have been spoiled that have wording to the effect of all of your damage can ignite or all of your damage can poison. It's very important to pick apart what exactly this means, because it's another thing I've seen a number of people getting wrong. There are 2 things that need to happen for damage to ignite. Firstly, the damage needs to have the capacity to ignite. Secondly, it needs to have sufficient chance to ignite. Capacity to ignite is automatic on fire damage and is not present on any other type of damage, although there are some things that can change this. For example, the unique ring Stormfire grants the capacity for lightning damage to ignite. So that means that lightning damage is then capable of inflicting an ignite on an enemy. But then you also need a chance to ignite. By default, this is 0% on non-critical strikes and 100% on critical strikes. And generally the best place to get this ignite chance is going to be the passive tree, although circumstances can vary and your build might not follow that pattern. Poison has its own nuances as well, but it's mostly the same deal. You need to get your chance to poison up close to 100% or ideally all the way to 100%. Otherwise, these tinctures are going to be a fairly disappointing waste of a flask slot. Lastly, just remember that those tinctures apply to your weapon damage as well. I don't think the wording is very clear on this, but the tincture is on your weapon, so damage that comes from your weapon gains capacity to ignite and poison. Can you reconsider making the new purchasable corpses able to be desecrated? There is a risk of losing your Spectre by just weapon swapping by accident, corpse getting eaten by a trigger, etc. Now these corpses are meant to basically transform the raised Spectre gem into something more akin to Animate Guardian, in that it becomes a minion that you invest in rather than a minion that you get for free. Now the quality of life changes they're making here are pretty minor and they don't deviate from that design. Basically I would say you don't want to invest in these specific purchasable corpses unless you know you are a very careful player when it comes to dealing with all of these sorts of shenanigans that can cause you to lose an important Spectre. I do not think this mechanic is going to be popular at all. Does each Wildwood NPC have a wisp associated with it? Yes, and there's been a couple of little changes since the live stream reveal here. 2 of these wisps have been transposed. What happened to Summon Raging Spirits minions deal X% more damage line? This got rolled into the gem. This is net neutral except in a couple of corner cases. One of these corner cases is in conjunction with Decay Support. Decay Support is bad, you probably shouldn't use it, and you certainly weren't delivering it through Summon Raging Spirits if you were using it, so that doesn't matter to anyone. The second thing is in conjunction with Minion Instability. Minion Instability is now worse in conjunction with Summon Raging Spirits, but Grinding Gear Games mentioned that there will be a Transfigured version that will help out with that. So that minions deal X% more damage was rolled into the base stats of the Summoned Raging Spirits. Can you clarify what happens to Labyrinth enchants on existing items that are in Standard League? The answer is that they will go Legacy. Do Tinctures apply globally or only to attacks with your weapon? They only apply to attacks with your weapon. We're sort of touching about this before when we were talking about those Ignite and Poison ones. The stats from Tinctures that are not local to the weapon, they're restricted to only applying to weapon attacks. This does include proxies that use your weapon, for example a Ballista or Blade Trap. While dual wielding, Tinctures apply to both weapons, and Tinctures don't work on minions that are based on your weapon, for example Dancing Dervish. What happens to my alternate quality gems in Standard? RIP. If you return to a Wildwood Ascendancy you've already completed quests for, will the game remember you've completed those quests? Yes. And can you clarify what's happening to Metamorph stash tabs? They're being transformed into Ultimatum stash tabs, which will be pretty much the same thing. Just as previously I had not recommended the Metamorph stash tab for most players, I'm not going to recommend the Ultimatum stash tab to most players. There will definitely be people who find a use case for it. It is possible to get so many catalysts that you couldn't fit them into a single stash tab, but the vast majority of players will be able to fit all of their Ultimatum fragments plus all of their catalysts into a single stash tab, and they'll be able to put Ultimatum Affinity onto it to make that easier as well. Anyways, that is the second lot of information that came out of Grinding Gear Games today. I'm going to leave it there. May your Icicle mines not be sabotaged.